Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. My heart was racing faster and faster as Mark and I approached the airport. Inside me, a sense of anxiety was growing, as if I were waiting for something unpredictable, something I couldn't control. We were about to meet Justin, Mark's nephew, who had decided to spend the summer with us. And even though it was just a family visit, one thought wouldn't leave me alone. A memory hidden in the back of my mind. "How are you, Barb?" Mark's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "I'm fine, just tired," I replied, trying not to meet his gaze. The smile on his face was as soft and kind as always, but in my mind, everything looked different. I avoided showing him that something inside me was falling apart. How could I possibly explain to him that the past was coming back with Justin? That summer evening a year ago, when a spark passed between Mark's nephew and me, one we both preferred not to talk about. The airport was filled with its usual sounds: flight announcements, the bustle of people, the clatter of trolley wheels rolling across the tiled floor. But in my head, one question echoed: what happens next? I glanced at Mark, his confidence, calmness, and joy in seeing Justin. He had always seen his nephew almost like a son, and I was supposed to share his feelings. But instead, something else was growing inside me, a feeling I couldn't suppress. We reached the arrival area, and there he was, Justin. Growing older but still carrying that boyish confidence, now with new traits. Maybe because of university, maybe from living away. He saw us and smiled, a smile I had feared seeing again. "Aunt Barbara!" He stepped toward me, and at that moment, my arms felt glued to my sides. His hug was brief, but long enough for me to remember that spark that flared between us last summer. It had appeared so unexpectedly, I had scared myself. Let alone Justin. He was much younger than me, but that minute, it was enough to leave a mark. Mark, of course, didn't notice anything. He hurried to embrace his nephew, discussing summer plans and asking about university life. I tried to join in the conversation, but everything I heard was background noise. My thoughts swirled. Why do I feel this? Why can't I push it out of my mind? The easy answer would be, it's just a temporary attraction, nothing serious. But deep down, I knew it was far more complicated. Something was wrong with the way I looked at Justin, and if only Mark knew what emotions were boiling inside me. In the car, I sat in the back seat, listening as the men talked up front. Justin was speaking about university, about his summer and study plans. His voice was calm and confident, but every time he glanced in my direction, it felt like he remembered that night too. Or was it just my imagination? Maybe I was simply stuck in the past? But that doesn't explain why, when I saw him, my hands trembled with that familiar shiver. When we returned home, I immediately retreated to my room, avoiding eye contact with Justin. Mark settled into the living room, talking with him about weekend plans, but I couldn't bear to listen to their conversation. My mind was consumed by something else. How could I prevent the past from becoming the future? Or had I already lost this battle with myself? Lying in bed, I tried to push away all my thoughts, but as I closed my eyes, I could only see that moment, when our eyes met a year ago. That connection, which shouldn't have existed, but still lingered between us, like an unbreakable thread. And now that he's here again, I'm no longer sure if I can resist what I've been hiding from for so long. The first step has been taken, and there's no turning back. The next day, we were getting ready for dinner, and tension was already in the air. Mark suggested a waterfront restaurant, a place he always considered perfect for such family gatherings. I, on the other hand, felt anxious at the mere thought of a long evening together, where I would once again have to face Justin and pretend that everything was fine, that nothing had happened. The restaurant was stunning, stylish, with panoramic windows that opened up to a sunset, casting an orange glow over the sea. The evening was beautiful, but inside me, it felt like a fire was smoldering. I kept trying to avoid looking at Justin so he wouldn't notice my unease, but every time our eyes accidentally met, something inside me tightened. We sat down at the table, and the waiter handed out the menus. Mark eagerly began discussing the dishes, suggesting we try something. His mood was light, almost carefree, as if this evening was just another typical family event. But I could feel it wasn't. Justin's gaze, his casual movements, his familiar smile, all of it reminded me of what had happened between us, and I couldn't breathe easily. It felt like everyone around could sense this tension, though no one uttered a word. Justin, any plans for the summer? Mark interrupted my thoughts with his usual question to his nephew. Well, I was thinking of working a bit and maybe doing some traveling. Justin leaned back in his chair, glancing at me for a split second. He held a pause as if weighing every word, trying to understand what I was feeling. And you, Aunt Barbara? What are your plans for the summer? His question sounded so innocent, but each word echoed unbearably inside me. I met his gaze for a moment before quickly looking away. The words got stuck in my throat, and I couldn't utter a sound, as if something inside me had blocked my ability to speak. Barbara's planning to get some rest, Mark answered for me, not noticing my turmoil. I think she deserves it after all the stress at work. Yes, a little rest won't hurt, I finally managed to say, forcing a calm smile that wouldn't betray my inner state. I looked out at the sunset through the window. The orange sky reflecting on the calm waves of the sea should have been soothing, but instead, it seemed like a symbol of something inevitable. Maybe it symbolized the end of the peace I had so long maintained in my marriage, and the beginning of something unpredictable and dangerous. The conversation at the table continued, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could feel was the growing tension between me and Justin. His presence seemed to fill the entire space. It was hard to breathe, as if every breath and every movement took effort. Do you remember when we went to the lake when Justin was 10? Mark suddenly asked, addressing both of us. I looked at Justin, who nodded, smiling as if the memory was pure and innocent. But for me, it was only a reminder of how our relationship had changed over the past years. Mark enthusiastically recounted how we fished, how we built a shelter on the shore. He laughed, remembering how Justin was scared of the large pike we had caught. Yes, it was fun, Justin confirmed, looking at me. Now I can invite you all to a new lake I found near my university. Mark got excited about the idea, but I just couldn't bear the thought of spending more time with Justin, far from home, far from the safety of familiar walls. This idea seemed dangerous to me, as if the very nature of our communication could spiral out of control. I think we should consider it, Mark said, looking at me with anticipation. I simply nodded in response, trying not to show my true feelings. Inside, everything was tightening with fear and confusion. The dinner went on, but I could no longer focus on the conversation or the food. All the words, all the questions, they were just background to my inner struggle. I knew that with each passing day, our interactions with Justin were becoming more complicated. I could no longer pretend I felt nothing. Every glance, every gesture from him was becoming more significant, and I realized the tension was building. When the dinner finally ended, I felt a sense of relief. We stepped out of the restaurant, and the evening breeze refreshed my face, but it couldn't calm the storm inside. I avoided Justin's gaze, sensing that any interaction between us only fueled the fire. Barbara, are you all right? Mark asked, looking at me with mild concern. Yes, just a bit tired, I answered, trying to smile as naturally as possible. We got into the car, and I watched as the city lights gave way to the darkness of suburban streets. My thoughts were far from reality, as fears, doubts, and hidden desires filled my mind. Justin sat silently in the back, but his presence was sharp. It felt as if he was waiting for something, for the moment when this tension would finally break. But I wasn't ready for that. I couldn't allow what had happened between us to happen again. Or could I? The evening was quiet, too quiet, and it created an unusual feeling of anxiety inside me. We had returned home after dinner, and Mark, tired, went to the living room to watch TV. I used his absence as an opportunity to escape outside, away from the heavy thoughts and tension that hadn't left me since my meeting with Justin. I walked into the garden, our cozy corner where we often spent warm summer evenings. But tonight, this garden seemed like a place where everything could change. The garden was bathed in soft lights, as if the moon had decided to come closer to the earth, flooding everything with its silvery glow. A light breeze stirred the leaves, creating a barely audible rustle. I walked along the familiar path, feeling the cold stone under my feet slightly cooling my restless soul. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. "Aunt Barbara," Justin called softly. I didn't know how to react. His voice sounded too close. Without turning around, I stopped, feeling the tension inside me rise. My heart was beating faster, as if anticipating something inevitable. "Are you taking a walk?" he asked, stepping closer, his shadow momentarily covering me. "Yes," I exhaled, finally turning to face him. We stood across from each other, and his eyes, gently reflecting the moonlight, seemed as deep as the ocean, capable of pulling me down to its depths. Justin took a step forward, and I felt his presence even more intensely. The sense that we were alone in this garden heightened my internal contradictions. "How was your dinner?" His voice was almost a whisper, but there was something more in it than just a simple question. I tried to focus on the conversation, to make it ordinary, as it had been before, when there wasn't this silent wall between us. But even the simplest questions now sounded different. "Good." Although, somewhat strange, I didn't go into details. He already understood everything. We started walking slowly along the path, but our steps felt too heavy. The silence between us seemed to fill the entire evening, and our words no longer mattered. I felt the ground beneath my feet slipping away, and at that moment, everything changed. "Barbara." His voice was too close. I stopped, unsure of how to move forward. He stopped beside me and gently turned me to face him, lightly touching my hand. That touch, so innocent, triggered a storm of emotions inside me. The wind quietly rustled the leaves, but everything around us froze, as if even nature was holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. "You feel it, don't you?" he said almost inaudibly, and there was the same tremor in his voice that was within me. I couldn't answer. My thoughts were jumbled. The words wouldn't come. All I could do was look at him, feeling his presence fill everything around me. And in that moment, time slowed. He stepped forward, and I felt his breath on my skin. My mind was screaming that this was wrong, that I couldn't allow this, but my body wasn't listening. Everything was happening too fast, and yet too slowly at the same time. I knew this moment would change everything. "Barbara," he said again, but this time closer, and before I could understand what was happening, he leaned in toward me, and then what I feared most happened. His lips touched mine. The kiss was gentle, but within it were so many repressed emotions, so much inevitability. I couldn't pull away, even though I knew it was wrong. I should have said no, but instead, my lips responded to his kiss. The world around us disappeared. I no longer heard the rustling of the trees, felt the cool wind, or noticed the moonlight. There was only this moment, the moment when reality faded, leaving just the two of us with our hidden desires. I knew this kiss was breaking all boundaries, and after it, there would be no going back. When he pulled away, I didn't immediately realize what had happened. My mind still couldn't accept reality, but my heart knew this was more than just a kiss. It was the beginning of something greater, something I couldn't control. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, stepping back, as if trying to justify himself. But I knew it was a lie. We both wanted this, and we both knew it was inevitable. We had been fighting these feelings for too long, and now they had broken free. "Justin!" I said his name, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't find any excuses for what had just happened. I stood before him, realizing that I had crossed a line I should never have crossed. I can't do this, I finally said, but my words sounded so unconvincing, as if I didn't even believe them myself. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the same doubts, the same fears. We both knew this was just the beginning. Every morning, I woke up with a feeling of heaviness. It seemed like my consciousness had split into two parts. One, the part everyone saw, calm and familiar Barbara, Mark's wife. The other, filled with secrets and false promises. With each passing day, I sank deeper into this whirlpool, and though my guilt weighed heavily on my shoulders, I couldn't stop. Justin and I kept meeting. He found ways to slip away, and I made up excuses for myself. It all felt like a game, dangerous but thrilling. We both knew it was wrong, but we couldn't stop. Soon, it became clear that our usual hideout in the garden was no longer suitable for secret meetings. We needed something more discreet. An abandoned cinema. What do you think? Justin suggested one day while we were texting. I froze for a moment, realizing how risky it was. Are you sure no one will see us? I replied, my fingers trembling, though I tried to hide it in the message. Yes, I arranged it. It's been closed for a few months. Only the tech staff occasionally checks the equipment, came the answer, filled with certainty. And I knew that he, like me, couldn't stop. And so, a few days later, I was already standing at the entrance to the abandoned cinema. A light breeze lifted the dust around, and I felt fear and anticipation mix inside me, creating a strange blend of emotions. You came! Justin's voice sounded behind me. I flinched, not expecting him to approach so quietly. His eyes gleamed, and in them, I saw the same mix I felt. Guilt, but also passion. Yes, I came, I answered softly, trying to hide my growing anxiety. We stepped inside, and the dimness of the abandoned building immediately surrounded us, as if wrapping us in a thick veil. Dust covered the seats, and there was a damp smell in the air. Justin took my hand, and in that moment, all my doubts disappeared, leaving only the pulsating tension. Why are we doing this? The question suddenly slipped from my lips as we sat in a dark corner, far from any light or prying eyes. You know the answer. He looked at me intently, his voice quiet but filled with confidence. We can't stop. I closed my eyes, trying to collect my thoughts. We sat close, and his presence felt so overwhelming that it made me forget everything. We spoke in whispers, as if afraid our secret could escape into the open at any moment. I feel terrible, I finally admitted. Every time I look at Mark, it feels like he knows. Justin was silent, but I saw his expression change. He understood. He knew this wasn't just a game anymore. It had become something far greater than either of us could have predicted. Barbara, if he knew, things would be different. You shouldn't think that way. We're in a situation that's out of our control. I turned away again, staring into the darkness of the theater. His words didn't bring me any comfort. Yes, maybe it was true. The situation had spiraled beyond our control, but I knew this couldn't go on. Or could it? And yet, I looked into his eyes, and the silence between us became even more palpable. What happens next? Justin leaned closer to me, his face so near I could feel his breath. Next? We keep going. That's what you want, isn't it? The words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't lie, couldn't pretend that this was just a fleeting attraction. But admitting to myself that I had long stopped being a faithful wife was unbearable. We kissed again, and this time, the kiss was different from the first. It was filled with more passion, more determination. This kiss spoke of how we both knew we couldn't stop. It was a revelation that there was no turning back. When we pulled apart, the silence engulfed us once more. The cinema, dusty and abandoned, seemed like a silent witness to our secrets. Does Mark suspect anything? Justin asked quietly, bringing us back to reality. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like he sees it. He asks questions, but I try to be the way I was before. It's so hard. We'll manage. His voice was steady, but in his eyes, I saw the same doubt that tormented me. We both knew it was getting more dangerous with each passing day. We left the cinema, and each step we took out was laced with anxiety. I glanced around as if shadows of our own betrayal were watching us. "You can always stop," he said as we stepped onto the street. But I heard in his voice that he didn't want that himself. "No, I can't," I whispered. We both knew it was the truth. At night, when the house quieted down and silence wrapped everything around, I would go outside to escape my own thoughts. This time, Justin suggested we take a walk on the beach. We agreed to meet late when everyone was asleep, so no one would notice our disappearance. The beach, not far from the house, was the perfect spot, deserted and quiet, where the night shadows and the sound of the waves could hide us. When I arrived, Justin was already waiting for me by the shore. The moonlight reflected off the surface of the water, turning the beach into a silver canvas. In the distance, all that could be heard was the monotonous roar of the surf. The night was cool, but not cold. The wind blew softly, as if embracing us, concealing our secrets. "Are you cold?" he asked when he saw me approach. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if he was afraid to break the magic of the night. "No, I'm fine," I replied, pressing my hands to my chest, more to calm my racing heart than because of the cold. We walked along the shore, unhurried, and our footsteps were barely audible on the sand. A silence hung between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In that silence, there was something more than just words, something we were both trying to understand and accept. "You know," he began, breaking the quiet, "all of this, what's happening between us, I never thought something like this could be." I shot him a quick glance, but didn't respond right away. His words echoed in my mind, making me reflect on how I too never expected this. Around us was only the sea and the sky, but inside me, a storm raged. "I didn't think so either," I finally said, feeling the cold water brush my feet. "It just happened, and I don't know how to react." He looked at me with a slight smile, one that held something more than just understanding. "Sometimes it feels like we're running away from something, or someone." Those words made me think. Was I running away? Perhaps I had long felt like I wasn't part of what had been between me and Mark. Our relationship had become more routine. It wasn't Mark's fault. He was still the same kind and reliable husband. But I had changed. What once felt solid now felt empty and cold. And here, with Justin, I felt alive again. "You're right," I said, looking out at the darkening sea. "I think something has changed in my marriage with Mark. Something has gone. I don't feel what I used to." It was the first time I said it out loud, and saying those words made me feel both lighter and heavier. As if I had confessed not only to Justin, but also to myself. "It's hard to accept," I added quietly. "I tried to be the same Barbara I used to be, but everything has changed." Justin stopped and looked at me, his face serious. "You don't have to live the way someone else expects you to, Barbara. This is your life." His words struck something deep within me. I knew he was right, but accepting it was harder than just saying it. The life I built with Mark seemed so predictable, and despite the coldness, it was still part of me. How could I destroy all of that for what I felt for Justin? We continued walking along the shore, and finally, I gathered the courage to talk about something that had been weighing on me. "Have you ever thought about the future?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the distant horizon. "Sometimes," he replied, slowing his pace, as if his own thoughts were growing heavier. "But with you, I don't know what it could be like. I just live in the moment." His words were both comforting and frightening. Neither of us knew what lay ahead. But perhaps that's why I felt alive. With Justin, everything was uncertain, risky, but that made it so real. And with Mark, stability that more and more resembled a cage. We stopped, and I felt the wind rise again, playing with my hair. The moonlight illuminated us both, turning the night into our shelter. Justin looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw the same doubts and fears that tormented me. "You understand that this can't last forever, right?" I whispered, feeling the inner conflict take hold of me again. "I understand." His voice was soft but firm, "but that doesn't mean I want it to end." I closed my eyes, feeling his words pierce my heart. Yes, he didn't want it to end, and neither did I. But this was a vicious cycle, and I didn't know how to break free from it. Mark was a part of my life, but Justin had become something I could no longer live without. And all I could do was keep running between them, trying to prevent both worlds from falling apart. We stood by the shore, surrounded only by the sound of the waves and the whisper of the night wind. I knew these were our last moments of quiet, and ahead, there was only the storm. The house I had lived in for over 10 years had begun to feel foreign to me in recent weeks. I remembered every corner, every detail that used to bring warmth and comfort. But now, as I walked through the rooms, it all seemed like mere shadows of the past. Each room reminded me of the happiness that was slowly fading away, of how I used to be different. A wife, loving and devoted to Mark, a woman who believed in the stability of her marriage. But now I could no longer be the same. Something irreversible was happening inside me. Justin had become an integral part of my thoughts and emotions, and even within the walls of this house, where confidence and peace once reigned, I felt nothing but unease. Mark wasn't a fool. He had always had a perceptiveness that helped him understand people, especially me. And although he didn't ask questions directly, I could feel his suspicions growing with each passing day. Sometimes I noticed how he looked at me intently when I got distracted or couldn't hold back a smile while reading a message from Justin. That evening, I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone when a message from Justin came through. "Hey, I miss you. Can we meet tomorrow?" I smiled involuntarily, looking at the screen, barely noticing Mark enter the room. When I lifted my eyes, his gaze was fixed on me, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't immediately understand. Was it suspicion, or just a moment of jealousy that had recently started flaring up between us? "Is something wrong?" he asked, sitting down across from me. His voice was calm, but there was a barely perceptible tension in it. "No, everything's fine," I quickly replied, trying to hide my unease. I set my phone aside, trying to appear as natural as possible. He fell silent for a moment, studying me as if trying to penetrate my thoughts. The silence was heavy, and I could feel that something had changed between us. There was a time when I could tell Mark anything, but now every conversation felt more difficult, every word a lie. "You've changed," he suddenly said, carefully choosing his words, as if afraid to upset me. "What do you mean?" I looked at him with a slight smile, hoping to avoid this topic. "You've become different. Sometimes I catch you looking distant, or smiling when you're alone with your phone." His voice was even, but suspicion clearly lingered in it. My heart began to race. He had noticed. Of course, he had noticed. Mark had always been attentive, and I knew that sooner or later he would start asking questions. "I'm just chatting with a friend." I quickly found an excuse. It was half true, as I did sometimes talk to my friends. But the real reason for my smile was something entirely different, and he seemed to sense that. "Are you sure?" Mark didn't look away, and I felt the tension in the room become almost unbearable. His face remained calm, but his eyes revealed something more. He had started to suspect, and those suspicions were growing by the day. "Of course," I tried to sound confident, but inside everything was screaming that the lie had already spiraled out of control. We lived in the same house, but every day it felt more foreign to me. And now I could see our relationship cracking at the seams. Mark stood up, pushing his chair back, but didn't leave. He paused in the doorway of the kitchen, glancing at me one last time before heading to the living room. "If something's going on, Barbara, tell me." His words sounded almost like a warning, and I knew this conversation was only the beginning of something bigger. When he left, I remained sitting alone in the kitchen. The phone lay next to me, and Justin's message was still on the screen. I stared at it, realizing that my relationship with Justin had already gone beyond secret meetings. It had seeped into my home, into my marriage, and now everything I did was an attempt to maintain a balance between lies and truth. Every room in this house reminded me of the past. Here we laughed, made plans, discussed the future. But now, in every detail, there was something different: alienation, emptiness, as if the building itself could no longer sustain what had once been solid. Even the photos that adorned the walls felt foreign to me. I looked at our shared pictures and couldn't remember the last time I felt the joy reflected in those images. Mark, of course, sensed it. His questions were becoming more direct, and I was sinking deeper into lies, trying to preserve at least the illusion of normalcy. But I knew this couldn't last much longer. He had already seen too much, and his suspicions were growing. Sooner or later, the whole truth would come out, and when it did, I would have no defense. I picked up the phone and reread Justin's message again. "I miss you." Those words echoed in my head. I missed him too, but I knew that with every meeting, I was getting closer to the inevitable moment of exposure. "What have I done?" I whispered, looking around the empty kitchen, now haunted not only by the spirit of past happiness, but also by the shadow of an impending disaster. Mark was still here, in the house, but between us, an insurmountable chasm was already growing. The trip to the lake was supposed to be an opportunity for Mark and me to figure out what was happening. At least, that was his idea. We both knew that our communication had turned into an empty formality. Weeks, months, it all blurred into one continuous silence, and even the most ordinary conversations felt strained. The lake, surrounded by a dense forest, had always been a special place for us. We used to come here before, when we were younger, when everything seemed simple. Here, away from the hustle and bustle, we could talk heart to heart, walk along the shore, and discuss the future. But this time, everything was different. Justin came with us, although I knew it would only complicate the situation. His presence made me tense. I felt my inner contradictions intensifying. Mark, of course, had no idea about the real reason for my distance, but his suspicions were growing. He saw how I was changing, becoming more and more distant. We arrived at the cabin by the lake late in the evening. The water gently lapped at the shore, and the air was filled with the scent of pine. Everything seemed so peaceful, but inside me, a storm was raging. "Let's go for a walk," Mark suggested after we had unpacked. Justin had gone to his room, giving us space, but even his silent presence in the house felt like a burden. I nodded, though I knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. We headed toward the lake, walking along the familiar old path. The wind played with the tree branches, and everything around us was sinking into the quiet of the evening. "Barbara," Mark began when we stopped by the water. His voice was firm, but there was weariness in it. "We haven't really talked in a long time. What's going on?" I froze, trying to find the right words. There was more in his question than just concern. It was a cry for help. He could feel that I was drifting away and wanted to understand why. "I don't know," I exhaled, avoiding his gaze. The words felt so empty, but it was all I could say at that moment. How could I explain to him that everything I once felt for him now seemed distant, blurred? "You've changed," he continued, not giving me a chance to escape. "You're not the same as you were before, and I don't know what it is. Is it work? Me? Something is happening, Barbara." His words cut deep into me. I felt the pain spreading inside me. He was right. Everything had changed, but I couldn't admit that it was all because of Justin. "Maybe I'm just tired," I said, still trying to avoid the truth. "We've had so much work, the house, responsibilities." Mark was silent, but his eyes betrayed that he didn't believe my words. He was searching for something in me that I could no longer give him. "I feel like we're drifting apart," he quietly said, "and it feels like I'm losing you." Those words hit me like lightning. He didn't know the whole truth, but his heart already sensed the growing rift between us. I wanted to say something that would ease his pain, but every phrase I thought of felt like a lie. Mark dot dot dot. I began, but then fell silent. I couldn't say what was on my mind. Admitting to him that something had happened between Justin and me would mean destroying everything completely. Mark turned away from me, looking at the lake. His shoulders were tense, and his hands clenched into fists. I could see him fighting with himself, trying not to lose control. "I love you, Barbara," he said, still staring at the calm water, "but I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to bring us back." Those words were so sincere that I couldn't hold back my tears. I really felt like our connection was fading, and I didn't know how to fix it. Mark's words were full of despair, but I couldn't respond in kind. The love that had once been so close now felt like something distant. When we returned to the cabin, Justin was already in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up at us, and in his gaze, I saw something new, an expression of guilt, an understanding that he had become the reason for our growing distance. He didn't say a word, but I could see that he felt the same way I did. "Would you like some coffee?" he offered, trying to hide the tension. "Yes, thank you," I replied, though my thoughts were far from here. We sat at the kitchen table, lost in our own thoughts, while Mark silently poured himself some water from the kettle. I saw how Justin avoided my gaze, and that only made my guilt heavier. He, too, understood that our presence together was destroying everything around us. When Mark went to bed, I stayed with Justin in the kitchen. We were silent. The silence was heavy, and I didn't know how to break it. Everything inside me was boiling, and I understood that this crisis was only the beginning of the end. "It's my fault," Justin finally said, staring into his cup. His voice was quiet, but I could hear the pain in it. "No," I replied, not knowing what else to say. We both knew the truth, but admitting it would mean bringing everything to an end. Night was falling over the lake, enveloping the cabin in silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me was crumbling. A few days later, the dawn chill pierced my body as I stood on the deserted train station, clutching a small bag in my hands. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and steel, and ahead of me stretched endless tracks, seemingly leading to nowhere. My gaze wandered over the rails as I tried to cope with the wave of emotions that crashed over me. In that moment, reality felt unbearably sharp, and the upcoming meeting, the last thread connecting me to something that was now impossible to get back. Justin was supposed to arrive soon. We had agreed to meet here, at this station, before his departure. He had decided to leave. I knew it was the right decision, but the pain that came with that realization was unbearable. Justin had become a part of my life, and his departure signified the end of something far greater than just a secret affair. When I saw his figure appear in the distance, I felt the tension inside me grow. He walked confidently, but there was something sad in his movements, as if he too realized that this farewell would be final. As he approached, I saw the same pain in his eyes that mirrored my own. "You're really leaving," I whispered when he stopped in front of me. "Barbara." His voice was quiet, but there was a determination in it that frightened me. "You know this is the only thing I can do. My life here no longer makes sense. I'm only making everything worse." I nodded silently, understanding that his words were true. We both knew that continuing these meetings would lead to disaster, but saying goodbye didn't make the situation any less painful. "I don't want you to leave." My words came out uncertainly, as if I didn't fully believe them myself. After all, I knew he had to go, but my heart resisted, refusing to let him go. "Barbara, you need to find a way to move on, to fix your life with Mark." His voice softened, and he stepped closer, taking my hands in his. "My role in your life is over. I can't stay here anymore." His touch was warm, and I felt it penetrate deep into my soul. Inside, everything screamed from the pain and loss. My life with Mark now seemed distant and foreign. With Justin, I had felt real passion, but that passion only brought destruction. You have no idea how hard this is for me. My words sounded almost like a complaint. I didn't know how to explain to him the real struggle happening inside me. Everything we did, I can't forget. I can't either, he replied, his gaze filled with the same pain. But this can't continue, Barbara. You understand that. I nodded, even though at that moment it felt like the world was crumbling around me. We stood on the empty platform, surrounded by the first rays of dawn, a symbol that our paths were diverging. The time had come, and we both knew it. I love you. The words slipped from my lips before I could even realize it. I hadn't expected to say them, but they were the truth. Justin had become the one who made me feel alive again, but he was also the one who had torn my life apart. He looked at me, and his face softened. I knew he felt something similar, but his departure was inevitable. Slowly, he leaned down to me, and our lips met in a farewell kiss, filled with passion, desperation, and bitterness. This kiss was completely different. It contained our entire story, from the first meetings full of excitement to the moment we realized this path led nowhere. It was our goodbye, the final touch that ended it all. I felt his arms tighten around me, as if he was trying to hold on to this moment forever. When we parted, I looked at him, and his gaze said it all. He couldn't stay. Our time was over. The train will be here soon, he said, glancing at the tracks. There was no more doubt in his voice, only determination. I nodded silently, knowing there was nothing more I could say or do. Everything that had been between us remained on that station, in that cold morning wind. You will be happy, Barbara, he said, hugging me one last time. You'll find your way. I didn't know if his words were true. I didn't know if I could ever restore my life to what it once was, but at that moment, I had no choice but to believe in his words. The train slowly approached, and Justin let me go. His figure, which had just been so close, was now becoming part of the departing morning. He took his bag and stepped onto the platform. I stood there, watching him until the doors closed and the train began to move. The iron wheels screeched, and the train slowly disappeared from sight, taking a part of me with it. When it was gone, I was left standing alone on the empty station, surrounded only by silence and memories of something that could never be returned. That day started as usual. Mark was immersed in his work, and I was in mine. We continued to move within the framework of our daily routine, but the tension between us was growing, as if fanned by invisible winds. I had known for a long time that things couldn't continue as they were. Something destructive had been growing inside me, a weariness from the lies, a guilt that was eating me from the inside, and the realization that this facade could no longer go on. I was tired. Tired of lying, tired of everything becoming fake. And then, as the sun was almost touching the horizon, I realized I could no longer live in this endless cycle. I had to tell him everything. I didn't know how Mark would react, but I felt that this was inevitable. We were sitting on the veranda overlooking the garden. Once, that garden had been a symbol of our happiness. The flowers we planted together reminded me of the years spent in love and harmony. But today, it seemed gloomy, like a reflection of what was happening inside us. I looked at the withered roses we had once loved. It was as if even they had lost their meaning. Mark sat across from me, silently staring into the distance. I knew this was the perfect moment, if such a moment could ever exist for a confession like this. Mark, I began, and my voice trembled. My heart was pounding as if it wanted to leap out of my chest. He looked at me, his eyes filled with concern, but there was something in them that made me feel even worse. There's something I need to tell you. Mark straightened, and his gaze sharpened. He sensed that I was about to say something important. My guilt washed over me in waves, and I could barely stay afloat. Something's been happening, and I don't know how to hide it anymore, I exhaled. I cheated on you, Mark. The words burst out, like poison. I saw how his face changed in an instant. His eyes widened, and he tensed. A deadly silence followed. My fear rippled through the air, and I felt my hands start to tremble. What? His voice was unexpectedly sharp, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. It was like a knife in the back. With Justin, I whispered, and tears started streaming down my cheeks. It's been going on for a while. I don't know how it happened, but. With Justin? His voice grew louder as he stood up, his face flushed with anger and pain. Are you joking? You cheated on me with my nephew? I couldn't meet his eyes. I had expected anger, but what followed was much worse. I felt as if our entire life together had collapsed in that one moment. This was the moment of absolute destruction. How could you? He yelled, his voice filled with everything: disappointment, pain, betrayal. I trusted you. We were together for so many years, and you betrayed me? With my nephew? He paced back and forth on the veranda, his breathing becoming erratic, and I saw his fists clenching. I didn't know how to explain to him what had happened. All I could do was stand there and watch as he lost control. I can't live with this lie anymore, I whispered. I had to tell you. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I couldn't. Mistake? You call this a mistake? Mark spun around to face me, his voice filled with bitterness. This is not a mistake, Barbara. This is betrayal. You've destroyed everything we had. My tears were flowing uncontrollably. I felt completely lost and broken. Mark's words seared me, but I knew I deserved them. What now? What are you suggesting? Do you think this can be fixed? His voice was filled with despair. Do you think I can just forgive you after all this? I don't know, I whispered. I just wanted to be honest with you. Honest? You call this honesty? His face twisted with anger. You've destroyed our marriage. I can't stay with you after this. He took a step towards me, his face so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. We're getting divorced, Barbara. I can't forgive you for this. You have to leave. Now. His words were like a sentence. I stood there, silently looking at him, unable to speak. My heart was shattered, but I knew this was inevitable. I had ruined everything, and now I had to face the consequences. Pack your things, Mark said sharply. I don't want to see you in this house anymore. I stepped back, realizing this was the end. I no longer belonged to this house, this garden, or these memories. Everything that had once been ours was now destroyed. I packed my things as quickly as I could and stepped outside. The garden, which had once been a place of our happiness, now stood as a symbol of our breakup. The flowers that once bloomed here now looked withered and forgotten, just like our happiness. As I walked through the gate, I felt utterly alone. The world around me was closing in, and I knew there was no going back. Mark was right. I had done something terrible, and now all that was left for me was to suffer the consequences of my actions.